Visibly Female, Feminism and Art Today is an anthology published in 1988, edited by Hillary Robinson, who also wrote the introduction. For full citation info, read the description below or see the end of this video. This book divides its content into 4 categories. First, personal statements concerning exhibitions and other artworks. Second, interviews of feminist artists. Third, reviews and overviews of significant works in the history of feminist art. And fourth, essays on theory, where the term is used broadly to describe a variety of feminist experiences. It closes with brief biographical information on the contributors and an extensive bibliography. At the time of this video's publication, it is nearly 30 years since this anthology's original publication. This book thus provides valuable historical context for those interested in feminism and social justice, allowing the reader to peer back 3 decades and compare and contrast the feminism of the 2010s with the feminism of the 1980s. In this video series, we will seek to fairly summarize the main points of this book, chapter by chapter, beginning with Robinson's introduction, which is particularly helpful in understanding the themes and goals of feminist art in general, and this book in particular. While my goal is to summarize this essay as fairly as possible, I will be trying to explain my understanding of the book in my own words. You should not look at this video as a replacement for reading Robinson's book for yourself, and if you have read it, I would appreciate any feedback if I've misunderstood anything I've read. It is noteworthy that this anthology is dedicated to the students at the University of Hull, 1986 to 1987, quote, "for whom the personal is becoming political." This gives us context on who the author had in mind while producing this anthology. Students at the University of Hull in the 80s. This book was intended as a teaching resource. Also of note, this book is prefaced by a quotation from radical feminist poet Adrienne Rich, published in 21 Love Poems as number 11. This poem describes personified volcanoes as female. Robinson's introduction begins by describing the 3 aims of the anthology: to collect articles which have previously been dispersed and difficult to access, to show the state of feminist art and theory at the time, and to show the wide variety of what could be categorized as feminist art with the intent of strengthening debate. Robinson discusses her students' role in motivating the book's production and underscores how there are many subgroups and opposing viewpoints which might be labeled feminism. In other words, rather than speaking of the feminist movement, singular, Robinson might prefer describing it as multiple feminisms and multiple movements. She identifies the one common base of these diverse feminist groups as, quote, "a recognition of the oppression of women." Robinson argues that there is a parallel between the diversity of politics within feminism and the diversity of approaches to making art in feminist art. This is in contrast with art movements such as Impressionism, where the style of painting and subject matter can identify an Impressionist painting. Robinson accuses what she calls the art establishment of trying to box in feminist art into a neat category, an attempt Robinson considers doomed to failure, arguing that feminist art might be either formal, political, or personal. Robinson rhetorically asks why this might be so, and for an answer points to Lisa Tickner's opinion that feminism is a politics, not a methodology. Thus, feminist politics must play a role in informing feminist art, regardless of where or how the feminist art is made. In other words, a work of feminist art may not be very political itself, but if the creator is somehow informed by feminist politics, then Robinson would accept that work under the broad umbrella term of feminist art. In simple terms, one might describe Robinson's distinction between different feminist arts as a distinction between those who work within the patriarchal system to change the system or work as a radical rebel from without. In this mental picture Robinson creates, the art establishment is the opponent of feminist art. Broadly speaking, the art establishment includes art schools, wealthy art collectors, art galleries and art centers, and individual artists and art critics, anything synonymous with the phrase the art world. Robinson then begins to describe a sorry state of affairs for feminist artists, where the topic of women in art might be covered by a few books, a couple of speakers, and that's it. Quoting Robinson, the regular, full-time male members of staff consider the matter is dealt with, and so feel no need to alter their own approaches to the material they teach, and the students they teach it to. From this, one could reasonably infer that the goal of this book is to change the material on art history being taught and how it is taught. Robinson describes what she considers a wrong-headed conflation of women and feminists. For example, if feminist students demanded more education in feminist art, the school might bring in a woman to teach who is not a feminist. Robinson considers this to be an insult to all women. Here I wish to present my opinion on the first important takeaway from Robinson's introduction. In Robinson's view, hiring a woman to teach or inviting a woman speaker for a lecture does not satisfy the aims of feminist politics. It must be a political feminist. Robinson goes on to rail against what she perceives as the difficulty of feminist students in achieving long-term success in creating a permanent women's group to make feminist art a lasting focus of Hull University. Robinson considers this a problem of feminist students not being taught their history and having to continually refight the same battles. As I understand it, Robinson is telling a story, and in this story, feminist artists are the underdogs. She believes that in order for women artists to succeed in the classroom and outside it, feminist political ideas must achieve a permanent foothold of institutional power within Hull University. Robinson segues to discussing postmodernism as the big hit of the 1980s in the art establishment. Whatever postmodernism is, Robinson considers it a mixed blessing for feminists. In the pro column for Feminism, postmodern art normalized artwork which was personal or focused upon people, artwork which used a variety of materials, and artwork which could not be easily categorized. In the con column for Feminism, politics and art fell out of favor, at least what the art establishment deemed political. To quote Robinson, political art meant that which refers overtly, questioningly, to race, class, sexual politics, or issues such as nuclear energy and arms. Not only was there a dearth of political art in the 80s, in Robinson's view, the political art which was made by recognizable artists presented its own set of problems. In my opinion, here we see Robinson describing two problems: the problem of white liberal hypocrisy for those who are radically committed to feminism, and the problem of how the politics of feminism are expressed to the average Joe and Jane through art. For example, in Robinson's view, a black artist such as Donald Rodney might have a politically themed art show in an elite gallery, but the only thing it achieves, quote, is the pricking of a few white liberal consciousnesses. Feminist artist Barbara Kruger might fill 100 billboards with overt sexual politics, but how is that any different from a cigarette ad to a truck driver who sees it on the road while listening to conservative talk radio? Robinson says she is not attempting to diminish these artists, but rather to call out how these institutions are containing radical politics. Again, I wish to underscore what I consider a second major point. Robinson is deeply concerned with how institutions and systems function and wants to see radical change to the point that the politics of feminist art are not contained to a polite art show in a gallery. The goals of the feminist art she describes are explicitly broader than art shows. This feminist art is seeking to change the culture as a whole. Robinson describes the popularity of male nudity in art as a mixed blessing for feminism. On the one hand, normalizing sex and nudity in art, but only, in her words, quote, depiction by men of the male hero and the male body. Robinson considers any serious depiction of sexuality to be totally absent from the postmodern art establishment. Robinson discusses how popular art dealing with sexual politics might be considered problematic under feminist scrutiny. She names Victor Bergen as a, air quotes, radical, using those air quotes to indicate this usage as a term of art, who still manages to follow a well-worn tradition of projecting his ideas of male sexuality onto the female body. Robinson considers the trend of postmodern art and these depictions of male sexuality as ultimately to the detriment of women. While the exhibition, A New Spirit in Painting, was considered by most to be the triumphant return of the human figure to art, Robinson would prefer the exhibition Women's Images of Men because only male painters were included in A New Spirit in Painting. Robinson believes that the popular art of the day, as approved by the establishment, was macho art. Big canvases, aggressive painting, such as Julian Schnabel and Anselm Kiefer. While there were examples of quieter painters who did not fit into this macho category, such as Adrian Wisniewski and Stephen McKenna, Robinson considered these to be nostalgic artists rather than radical artists. Here I wish to underscore a third important point. In my understanding, it was not enough for feminist art to merely change the art scene of the 1980s or to look back on older art for inspiration. Its goal was fundamental change in how art had been understood and how it should be understood in the future. Do you love the works of great artists such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Caravaggio, or Rembrandt? Well, from the perspective of feminist art, the very idea of a great artist is a loaded patriarchal term and must change. Sure, female artists such as Alexis Hunter, Rose Garrard, and Susan Hiller might achieve star status, but in Robinson's words, tokenism is a useful way of both calming dissent and soothing the conscience, and therefore of containing feminist politics. It does not satisfy the goals of this philosophy of feminist art if a few more women become famous and successful artists. Its goals are not even satisfied if the majority of women become famous and successful artists. The radical politics which is integral to feminist art seeks a fundamental transformation of the art world as a whole, so that feminist politics are not contained within the arts. This concludes the first half of Robinson's essay, defining and describing the nature of feminist art and its current state in the late 1980s. The second part describes her research attempting to build a history of feminist art from various sources, starting in 1985 to 1986. She found little information on lesbian artists, black women artists, Irish women artists, or feminist artists. She called these imposed silences appalling. Here we see Robinson expressing a feminist concern for representation, using words like unforgivable to describe the women's movement for not providing a platform for lesbian artists. As she compiled these resources, she writes she was struck by, quote, the energy and enthusiasm they contained in comparison to much art criticism by men. She attributes this to feminist artists having an emerging political platform in contrast to the dying platform for modernism. She then describes broadly the organization of the remainder of the book and her emphasis on personal statements by artists, chosen to reflect the slogan, "The personal is political," just as Robinson does not view artists as merely individuals, but as members of a, quote, wider political cultural context, unquote. She also views theory not as a body of monolithic knowledge, but as a collection of contextual experiences. In other words, feminist art theory is not so much a list of concrete truths as it is a collection of experiences from groups deemed marginalized. Robinson summarizes her main points, returning to the theme of diversity within feminist art. She expresses hope that this book will promote more understanding amongst feminist groups. She offers thanks to multiple individuals, and finally closes with a note that the anthology preserves all style, punctuation, and spelling from the original documents. This concludes my summary of Robinson's introduction. Where I have introduced my comments and interpretations, it has been to underscore what I personally consider to be the key takeaways from this essay and why it is relevant to contemporary discussion about the arts in 2017 and beyond. To review, Robinson describes feminist art and the politics of feminism as intrinsically linked, and just as the personal is political, so feminist art can be deeply personal and diverse in how it's made, where it's shown, and what message it may or may not communicate. A distinction is drawn between advancing women in the art world and advancing feminism in the whole culture, and Robinson firmly advocates for feminist art students to use radical tactics to demand a permanent position for feminist art instruction at Hull University and other art institutions. As feminism is a politics, not a methodology, its goals are achieved only by radically restructuring the art establishment, which Robinson sees as quietly containing the radical nature of feminism. Postmodernism is discussed as a trend which may open doors for feminism, but is also problematic due to the influence of male artists. She describes a traditional view of art as dominated by the work of individual, predominantly male artists, which she considers antiquated and contrary to the goals of women, and points to a future where feminist art politics will replace this traditional view with a new vision of art and the art world. Robinson then describes her research and rails against the lack of historical information on and representation of feminists, racial and ethnic minorities, and lesbians in the broader art world and art history literature. In what I frankly consider to be a casually bigoted and misandrous statement, she favorably contrasts feminist writings with writings by men, deeming the former to be energetic and the latter to be antiquated. While summarizing the contents of the anthology, Robinson connects the slogan, "The personal is political," to the book itself and its emphasis on the personal experience of politically motivated feminist art. My view? You're damn right these people want to mess with your video games and comic books, but they haven't been coming since #Comicsgate or #Gamergate, or even since the start of Twitter. They've been coming since before most of us were born, and in this fight for the culture, they've been in it to win it. I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys. Why don't you like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that bell to be notified of the next installment of this series, where we will begin to discuss personal statements from feminist artists and a view of feminist sexuality in art. Ba 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 da ba. In the